little rest that evening. The next day, Luke tells us that he and the men who had been traveling with him met in the house of James, the half-brother of Jesus, with all the apostles, all the elders present there, and presumably that contribution that had been taken up by all the Gentile churches has been handed over to those elders. And they discussed some things. They gave some updates on both sides, on the progress among the Gentiles, and the elders gave the progress of the gospel going forth there in Jerusalem, and both sides were greatly encouraged by these reports. But then the elders, they had somewhat of a strange request of Paul, you remember? And that was, since many of those Jewish Christians who were from the Jewish background there in Jerusalem, they had heard things about Paul, things that weren't entirely accurate, and so the elders had proposed a solution, and that was that Paul would go into, that there were 4 men who had taken a vow, and they suggested that Paul would kind of show his stance a little bit, that he wasn't there to completely eradicate the Jewish system and the traditions of their fathers from their lifestyles, but instead they urged Paul to go in with these 4 men who had taken a vow, and to pay the charges that were involved in that process, to assist them in that process, and that would go a long way maybe in kind of quelling some of these false accusations, and maybe it would kind of set the stage for unity. And so Paul did this. Paul didn't argue in any bit. Now we understand there's some complications with that. We have more questions probably than we have answers in relation to some of those things, but Paul did this, and then as he did so, we read that these Jews from Asia were there present, and they saw Paul in the temple after a few days, and they made this assumption that the men with him, one of them was Trophimus from Ephesus, a Gentile, which if that was the case, then he had traveled past the acceptable location within the temple for him to be, and this caused outrage. Now, I think it's important for us to point out right here now that this doesn't mean that the elders' idea was a failure. We need to differentiate these two different groups. We don't have a report as to whether this idea, this plan of the elders worked as far as the Jewish Christians were concerned. What we need to realize is the ones causing the trouble here are not the Jewish Christians, but they are Jews who are from Asia, 2 different groups. And so some might get the idea that some might mix those up and say, well, this was an utter failure. No, it may have been a great success among the Jewish Christians in the congregation, but who was the troublemakers? Yeah, the troublemakers were these Jews from Asia. And it very well could have been Alexander the Coppersmith and Demetrius and that same crew that Paul has already dealt with while he was in the region of Ephesus. And then verse 30, I think maybe we'll pick up right there. And so the people were outraged. The people who stirred up this mess, the Jews from Asia, the Jews from Asia that stirred this up, they hollered at the people, verse 29, I believe. Verse 28, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place." And for they had seen him before with Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And so there's a lot of assumptions in there, false accusations. Verse number 30. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul, and they drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. Now, of course, and I'm saying this with sarcasm, of course it's okay to drag a man out of the temple and beat him without a trial, just as long as you don't defile the temple with his blood in doing so. Isn't that the same mentality they had toward Jesus? It's okay to have an illegal trial with false witnesses and condemn an innocent man to death as long as his body is taken down off the cross before the Passover. So we see the same mentality here again with Paul. And, Jesus told Paul that he was going to suffer a great many things for his name's sake. And it almost, if you really think about it, there's a lot of parallels with what Paul is going through, with what Jesus went through, and also what Stephen went through. And remember, Paul was there holding the coats of them who stoned Stephen. And Paul's going through a situation almost exactly like Stephen. And so he's kind of, you might say, he's kind of getting what he dished out, right? Not that that's necessarily what's purposefully happened. Maybe it is. Maybe God determined that he was going to suffer in this way because of what he did. I don't know. But at any rate, his grace is sufficient for us, isn't it? If that is the case. Verse 31, and as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. And the chief captain here, as some versions say, the commander of the garrison or the commander of the Roman cohort. This is a local officer who is in charge of security, located there at the temple of Antonia on the screen behind us. That was a fortification that was built during the intertestament period. However, the Romans, when they took over, they made this their little base of operations within Jerusalem so they could keep an eye on the Jews, because, of course, the Jews are kind of unruly. And as God always said, they were a stiff-necked and uncircumcised of heart and kind of people. And, well, the Romans have come to that same conclusion, and generally speaking. And so they're keeping eyes on them. They've got a garrison right there next to the temple complex. Thankfully, for Paul's sake, it was. And this Roman officer that's in charge, we learn in chapter 23, verse 26, his name is Claudius Lysias, because he sends a report to Felix when they actually have to take Paul into protective custody, and they have to get him out of Jerusalem for his own life's sake. That officer sends a report, and so we find his name there in chapter 23, verse 26. And verse number 32, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down into them. And when they saw the chief captain and soldiers, they left or stopped beating Paul. Well, they were intimidated by this Roman force, which was quite sizable, and that can be noticed within the details of this very verse. The word translated chief captain or commander refers to a person in the Roman army who had charge over 600 to 1,000 men. That doesn't necessarily mean all those men were there, but he took with him 2 centurions. And the centurions, plural, had a command over about 100 men. And so they're very likely, there could have been as many as 200 or more soldiers there accompanying them. That would have certainly been a sizable force that would have got the Jews' attention, might have been a needed one to stop such a riot that was starting to break out. Verse 33, then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. This, of course, this verse right here is the fulfillment of those prophecies that Paul had been receiving on the way to Jerusalem. Remember that prophet Agabus took his girdle or his belt and wrapped around him and said, such will the one who wears this belt be bound and delivered unto the Gentiles. And so here it is. Here he is. He's bound with 2 chains. The commander, of course, will have to write a report about this incident. And so he wants to know the answers. Why have you done? What has happened here? Who are you and what have you done to cause all this uproar? Because we have a report in chapter 23 that he sent to Felix, but verse number 34, and some cried one thing and some another among the multitude, and when he could not know the certainty of the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And so since the accounts were conflicting, they started carrying Paul back to the barracks so they could interrogate him there. Verse 35, and when he came up on the stairs, that is the stairs going up into the fortress of Antonia there, when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. In other words, they carried him because the violence was so strong. And perhaps Paul, remember that Paul was already beaten for a time. However long it took the soldiers to get from that tower into the temple complex, Paul's getting beat during that amount of time. And so maybe Paul at this point is still seeing stars. Maybe he's walking kind of slowly. And this, it seemed this crowd, this bloodthirsty, murderous mob, sees their prey about to get away, and so it becomes violent again. They're trying to get to Paul, so the soldiers have to physically lift him up and carry him out of their reach. Verse 36. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, "Away with him!" They're chanting, "Away with him." Is stated in a little more detail in the next chapter, and later on in this, or is it? No, it's in the next chapter. Let me change something right here in my notes. In chapter 23, I believe it's verse 22. Can someone confirm that for me? Chapter 23, verse 22. That it is recorded that we're there that they said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live." Is that verse 22 of chapter 23? Chapter 22? Chapter 22. Okay. All right. Well, I had it right then. Okay. For some reason, I was thinking there that I was in chapter 22 presently. Sorry about that. Okay, but thank you. And so incidentally, just a side note of interest, they're probably within a few feet from a spot where another mob used very similar words and demanded the death of Jesus. Luke chapter 23, verse 18, John 19:15. When there was a chance for the crowd to receive Barabbas or Jesus, they said as far as Jesus, "Away with him, crucify him, we want Barabbas." Probably within feet of the same location. All right. Verse number 37. Now we're starting, if we look back at our outline here, Paul's defense, verse 37 through 40. And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, "May I speak unto thee?" Who said, "Canst thou speak Greek?" And so Paul here is observing military etiquette. He asked permission to speak, and the officer was apparently surprised to hear him speak in Greek. And so now maybe, Paul was an educated man from Tarsus of Cilicia, one of the educational capitals of the world. So but that doesn't explain why he could speak Greek, because Greek was the universal language at this time, which begs the question, why was this man surprised that he spoke in Greek? I think probably the answer to that is perhaps he was surprised at the quality of Greek that Paul spoke with. That could very well be the case. I don't understand. I don't really know why he would be surprised at him speaking the universal language that was everywhere spoken during that day, unless it was something about his dialect, something about the quality of his Greek, or perhaps the fact that he assumed him to be this Egyptian that's talked about in the next verse. And so the commander asks him this rhetorical question, "Canst thou speak Greek?" Well, obviously he can. He just spoke to you in Greek. Verse 38, and this is the commander speaking, "Art thou not that Egyptian, which before these days madest an uproar and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" Now what led this man to this assumption? Here's another assumption here's another example of jumping to conclusions. The Jews jumped to conclusions when they assumed that Paul brought a Gentile into the temple. And now here's another jumping to conclusions here, just assuming that this. Now maybe someone in the crowd, when they were given this answer and that answer and not agreeing, maybe someone said, "This is that Egyptian that you guys are looking for. He's on Rome's most wanted list. This is him." And so maybe that's the case. And so according to the Jewish historian Josephus, about 3 years earlier from this occasion, an Egyptian claiming to be the Messiah had led an army to the top of the Mount of Olives. He had threatened to cause the walls of Jerusalem to collapse like the walls of Jericho, after which he and his army was going to take the city away from the Romans. The Roman governor Felix had attacked those rebels. 400 of those men had been killed and 200 captured, but the Egyptian who started all this had escaped. And so since that time, he had been very high up on Rome's most wanted list. Apparently, this officer thought that this agitator that had fallen into their hands was that Egyptian. And so what led him to that conclusion? Maybe someone said it. Maybe he just assumed it. At any rate, it was false. Verse 39, but Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and in other words, not a backwater city. I'm from an Ivy League school. Give me a little credit. And beseech thee, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. And so Paul's identification here points out three things. Number one, he showed that he was not the Egyptian in question. Number two, he showed that he was a Jew and had the right to be in the temple. And three, identifying himself as a citizen of Tarsus, which was a city of cultural and political preeminence. He was also pointing out the fact that he was a responsible individual, not the type of person generally known to start a riot or cause trouble. Okay? Verse number 40. And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with his hand unto all the people, and there was made a great silence, and he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, all right, that brings us to the end of the chapter. The commander gave Paul permission to speak, probably because he thought maybe through hearing him speak and seeing the reaction, maybe he would discover what this disturbance was about after all. Interesting that the way the chapter is divided up there right in the middle of a sentence with a comma there at the end. It's kind of a strange place to divide for a chapter, but at any rate, there wasn't punctuation marks in the original Greek, but still it's right there in the middle of a sentence. In relation to this statement that he spoke in the Hebrew tongue, one commentator I read pointed out something that from my understanding of history, this is true. Now, he noted that since the time of captivity, the Hebrew language had become Aramaic, and that is probably what Paul spoke when he spoke in the Hebrew tongue or dialect, which at that time was Aramaic, not ancient Hebrew. Now, that sounds reasonable to me, unless there's information that suggests otherwise. I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. All right, that brings us to the end of chapter 21. Any questions from that chapter? Yes, sir.
I think that most commentaries would say that Jesus generally spoke Aramaic as part of their everyday language. And, that Hebrew was mainly known for those that studied the scriptures. That's the group that knew a lot of those, because those originally.
And Paul would have qualified for that, but how many of his listeners would have?
Right.
And so.
So I think you're right. He's trying to say what the Hebrews, what the Jews spoke is probably Aramaic. But I don't know that it matters, other than us knowing that language changed over time, where most of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, and then later it's written in Aramaic, I think. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it had been translated into Greek.
Right. Once they got into captivity, even the scriptures, Daniel, first and second part of the Chronicles are written in Aramaic, and so they lost the Hebrew language. I mean, some of the well-versed people and even some rabbis today know a little bit of it, but there's no one who can tell you. I mean, even you try to do word studies on Hebrew words, and a lot of words you'll find out, well, the meaning to this Hebrew word in the Bible has been lost somewhat. And you're like, how can you lose the meaning of a word in the Bible when this is your language? And that's why. When they were carried into captivity, a lot of these things were lost. As far as the language he spoke there, I think this is an interesting point to make. He's already demonstrated that he can speak in Greek, and Greek is the universal language. He could have very well addressed the crowd in Greek, and everyone would have understood it. Why Hebrew? Or why Aramaic, whichever it be the case? Why? I think probably trying to relate to his audience, trying to get their attention. He's trying to identify with them. Because if you notice the words that he's about to say, he starts his speech off by showing them I understand where you're coming from. I know why you're reacting the way you're reacting, because I once was just like you are. That's exactly how he starts this out. And so he's trying to relate to his audience. And I think that's probably why he changed this language, because it endeared him. It would have somewhat endeared him to the audience. And any more questions or comments, chapter 21? Right. Yeah. And you can kill somebody pretty fast when you get a crowd of people beating them. And if you notice this little legend right here, I don't know, you can't read that back there, I'm sure, but that is a football field. Look how big this is. This is the size of a football field. How long did it take them to get from here to realize there's a problem, shout out the orders, travel down the steps, come up into the temple complex and get the pile? How long did that take? 10 touchdowns. I like that answer. So they could have definitely killed Paul. It's likely, but I do believe that it probably was the providence of God involved in that situation. All right. So Paul was saved by the Romans' ability to score 10 touchdowns. All right. Chapter 22 then. Chapter 22. We'll start with an overview of this chapter. And I'll have the outline on the screen. In this chapter, we have the recording of Paul's speech as he does turn around on the steps and start addressing these Jews who were just attempting to beat him to death. He gives a defense of his character, a defense of his actions. He gives his conversion account, the second of 3 conversion accounts of Paul recorded in the book of Acts. In chapter 9, we had the first. Here in this chapter, we have the second. And then in chapter 26, before Agrippa, we will have a third account of Paul's conversion. And then he gives an account of his commission to go preach the gospel to the Gentiles, which seems to be the point at which the Jewish audience wants to hear no more. That's really the thing that angers them, right? Why do you think it is that his mention of the Gentile, the gospel going to the Gentiles, makes them so angry? Well, I think that suggests then that there is a way of salvation that does not include them becoming proselytes to the Jewish religion. And that's what made them angry. No, we have salvation exclusively through Judaism. Don't you dare say there's another way to God than through us. And I think that's kind of what, maybe the root of what made them so angry about it. But once he mentions the Gentiles, it's pretty plain that's when they don't want to hear anymore, and they say, away with this fellow, he deserves to die. And so the Romans were about to scourge Paul, but then he mentions his citizenship, and it being against Roman law to scourge a Roman citizen who has not had a proper trial, that Paul escapes, again, probably providentially here, he escapes being scourged. And then the chapter ends with the Roman commander the next day calling the Jewish council or the Sanhedrin together in order to gather the facts concerning the previous day's events. All right, that's an overview of the chapter. Let's dig in. Verses 1 through 5, Paul's past life as a persecutor. Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense that I make now unto you. Just want to mention this word, this Greek word defense. It's one that's of importance sometimes. The Greek word here translated defense is apologia. It's a compound word. Apo means from, and logos means word or reason, and then from reason. Apologia is the word from which we get our English word apology. But this is not the kind of apology where you're acknowledging a wrongdoing and saying I'm sorry for it. This is the type that we don't use the word apology as much these days in this particular definition of it, but this is giving a defense. This is defending one's action, giving an apology. And so there's a lot of ancient documents that are apology messages, and we associate these, it's a study, we even have this field of apologetics, the study of arguments in favor of the Christian faith. It's the field of apologetics. Apologia is found 8 times in the book of Acts. 7 of those times occurs in chapters 22 through chapter 26. So I thought it might be good for us to go ahead and mention that and notice it now. Of course, this is the same word that when Peter says that we ought to be ready to give a defense of the faith that is within us. And so same word there. That's a time outside of these chapters where it's used. It has been suggested that the final 1/4 of the book of Acts could serve as a legal defense, as Luke showed again and again that Paul was not guilty of breaking any law of Rome. Verse 2, and when they, a parenthetical statement, and when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue, they kept more silent, and he saith, stop right there. One of the commentators, Red Roper, says most, if not all, of them would have understood Paul if he had spoken in Greek. Paul, however, wanted to establish a rapport with them. End quote. And so Paul had not lived in Jerusalem. Paul was a well-known student sat at the feet of Gamaliel, as he's about to mention. He was once well-known in Jerusalem, but there's been quite a bit of time. He spent 3 years in Arabia after he was converted, remember? And then some time before his first missionary journey, and then he's been on these missionary journeys. It's been about 20 years since Paul lived in Jerusalem. And so he's not the well-known person that he used to be. And so his first objective then seems to be identify with his audience. He wants them to know that he understands them and their actions. Verse 3, I am verily a man, which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law with the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. And so, according to the accolades that Paul mentions here, or these details about his character, he says that he's from Tarsus, which is of the a city in the Roman province of Cilicia. As we have before noted, this was a city of cultural and political preeminence, one of the 3 most prominent educational centers of the Roman Empire, along with Alexandria in Egypt and Athens in Greece. And so this would have been the prestige that Paul would have had, just as being from this location, might be comparable to someone having a degree from an Ivy League school. That's why he keeps mentioning it. He said, "And no mean city," he said before. And however, even though he was raised for some undisclosed amount of time in Tarsus, by the time he was of an appropriate age to do so, his family moved him to Jerusalem, and he became a pupil of Gamaliel. Now, Gamaliel, we've talked about him before. He was a well-known scholar, considered one of the greatest rabbis who ever lived by the Jewish people. And he had died about 5 years before this occasion, according to secular historians. Paul's religious credentials could not be faulted. And Paul was also making the point that he was raised a Pharisee. He doesn't say it explicitly right here, but Gamaliel was a Pharisee. And what did he say? He said, at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law with the fathers. Paul is implying that he's a Pharisee. He's a member of the strictest sect of the Jewish religion. Paul explicitly states that in other verses in the next chapter, chapter 23, verse 6, chapter 26, verse 5, and Philippians 3:5. All 3 of those passages, he explicitly states that he was raised a Pharisee. He wasn't just an indifferent Jew either. A person can say a Christian today, and we don't know what to gather. We see somebody on the street, and they say, "Oh, I'm a Christian," and we don't know what to gather from that, because some people don't know really what a Christian is. Some people's definition of a Christian is very weak, and so we got some indifferent Christians, and then we got some really serious Christians. And so Paul's establishing here that he wasn't just some indifferent Jew. he was zealous, even as zealous as the ones who were attacking him just moments ago, which he's going to prove that statement in the verses to follow. Verse 4 and 5. How zealous are you, Paul? How zealous were you, Paul? And I persecuted this way, and he's talking about the Christian religion again. There's Luke using that word, the way, again, as a synonym for Christian religion. And I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. Also as the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom I also received letters unto the brethren, and went into Damascus to bring them which were bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. Of course, we have record of these events. Paul is talking about the events of chapter 7, 8, and 9 of the book of Acts. Chapter 7, we have the account of Stephen's death, and at the end of that chapter, we learn that Paul was standing by watching this and giving consent to it. Chapter number 8, the church was scattered because of the persecution of Saul. And then chapter 9, he was commissioned by the council there to go to Damascus and get Christians and bring them back to be punished in Jerusalem. And so Paul states that. He says the estate of elders. The King James American Standard Version, both of those versions say the estate of elders, but the New King James and the New American Standard says the council of the elders. Both of these phrases are just other ways of saying of referring to the Sanhedrin Council. This is the highest body court among the Jewish nation, the Sanhedrin Council. And so Paul's calling upon them saying that, hey, the highest body of the land, they can testify that what I'm saying to you here is true today. If anyone was going to object, they could have objected at that very moment, and they did not. And so Paul made his proof plain. Now, Caiaphas had been high priest during the time when Paul was persecuting Christians, but when Paul was speaking on the steps of the fortress of Antonia there was a new high priest, and his name was Annas, chapter 23, verse 2. And it's possible that some of the present members of the Sanhedrin, perhaps even the high priest, had been part of the council that had commissioned Paul to go to Damascus. If so, these could confirm his words. It's also possible that Paul was suggesting that if need be, the records of the Sanhedrin could confirm what he was saying. Someone look in chapter 23, verse 2 for me and tell me if that says Ananias or Annas. Ananias? Okay, I was pretty sure that Annas was the name of the priest that followed Caiaphas, but I had Ananias in my notes, so maybe there's alternate spellings, or maybe my memory's just off on that.
Annas the high priest when Jesus was, Caiaphas was his father. He went
That's
to Annas first because of respect for that, but Annas was actually the high priest.
okay. That's probably the problem.
That's why it's probably in your notes, but I think it's a different one.
Okay. Well, thank you for straightening that out. That is probably that sounds exactly like that's probably the answer for that. So we have quite a few generations of high priests listed there in the Bible then, don't we? We have Annas, we have Caiaphas, and then now we have Ananias. Okay, any questions leading in verses 1 through 5? Okay, verse 6, he starts talking about his conversion. Verse 6 through 16. And it came to pass that as I made my journey and was come nigh to Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And I fell unto the ground and heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. And so after showing that he understood his audience who had attacked him, now he's in effect asking them, now I want you to try to understand me, okay? I understand where you're coming from. I was where you are. But now please try to understand me for a minute. If this happened to you, what would you do? He didn't say that. I think that's what he's implying. On his trip to Damascus, It was the furthest thing from his mind that he was going to become a follower of Jesus Christ. But something astonishing happened to him on that road. He had not gone looking for the Lord, but the Lord come looking for him. Verse 9. And they that were with me saw indeed the light, and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. And so Paul reports here that they heard not the voice of him who spake to me. But you might notice in chapter 9 in Acts 9:7 says that they heard a voice but saw not the speaker. Now this is one of those situations where the Bible critics will quickly declare, well, the Bible's full of contradictions. See, here's one of them right here. But what they fail to take into consideration is there's a simple solution to this found in the third account of Paul's conversion. In Acts 26:14, Christ is shown to have spoken in the Hebrew language, a language which the men with Paul would not have understood. They heard the sound of the voice, but they didn't hear the message spoken. And so there's the answer. This is another example of when you take all the accounts together. A lot of times the answers to our questions are, we'll find the answers to these questions. And so what looks like a contradiction isn't a contradiction at all. There's a perfectly good explanation for it. Verse number 10. And I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, arise and go into Damascus, and there it shall be told thee of all the things which are appointed for thee to do. So this phrase, what shall I do, Lord? This question was a cry of relief from the burden of guilt. I'm using Roper's words here. These are too pretty to be my own, but I liked them, so I put them in my notes. He says, this question was a cry for relief from the burden of guilt. What shall I do, Lord, to make amends for and be forgiven of my misguided zeal, in other words? Up to this point in his life, Paul had thought that he knew exactly who he was, where he was going, and how he was going to get there. Suddenly his life had been turned upside down. His self-image had been demolished. His agenda had been destroyed. He no longer had plans for the future. He was thus also asking, what shall I do, Lord, with the rest of my life? And until we are willing to ask that question, Christ can never make a difference in our life. Well, I thought that was a tremendous statement right there. Had to put it verbatim in my notes. What a tremendous point. In verse 11 and 12, and when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came unto Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there. Now, let me just stop and point out here that Ananias was also a Christian. Chapter 9, verse 10, when his name is mentioned, he is called a disciple. And so he was a Christian and he was a Jew. Paul does not identify him here as a Christian. He just identifies him as a devout Jew. I think I probably know why he didn't bring that point up, because the Jews would have held him in high esteem. If he was held in high esteem by the Jews of Damascus, he was probably held in high esteem by there, and so that would tend to soften maybe the mob's stance a little bit. Verse 13 and 14, continuing that thought of Ananias, having good report of all the Jews that dwelt there, came unto me and stood and said to me, Brother Saul, receive thy sight. And the same hour I looked upon him, and he said, the God of our fathers has chosen thee, that thou shouldest know his will, and see that just one, and should hear the voice of his mouth. And so Ananias reported to Saul that God had chosen him, that he might learn the will of God, see Christ, and hear the voice of the just one. That's an important point, that it was God's will that Paul should see Christ. Because one of the qualifications of being an elder is what? To see Christ. You have a question or comment, brother?
Like one point here on
Okay.
one word that is in this particular part that is not in chapter 9.
Mm-hmm.
That's the word there found in verse 10.
Okay.
In the city of Damascus, and there it shall be told thee of all things which are appointed for thee to do. When it does not use the word there in chapter 9, here though is specific in telling everybody, including us today, 2,000 years removed,
That's a good point.
Salvation was not happening there. He was gonna be told, go into the city, and there specifically,
Mhm.
something's gonna happen that's gonna turn your life around. It's not happening here. The denominational world would have us believe that at this point, Paul was saved. He was saved on the road to Damascus. False.
Well, they want that for what reason? Why do they want Paul to be saved on the road to Damascus rather than in Damascus? Get around baptism, because that's part of our religious dogma. That's part of what makes us the denomination that we are. And if we deny that, then we'll get kicked out, et cetera, et cetera. Good point. We're going to need that from time to time when we're studying people to point out that this verse 10, that it was in Damascus. And then specifically verse 16, arise, be baptized, and for what purpose? When he got to Damascus, when he was standing in front of Ananias, he still had sin. He had to have that sin washed away. Thank you for that comment. Verse 14 again. All right, we'll stop right there. We'll pick back up at verse number 14 next week. I appreciate your attention and your comments.